The dog walker refuses payment during owner's cancer treatment, never knowing family left her fortune. This thought echoed in Margaret Wilson's mind as she trudged through the rain-slicked streets of Oakwood Heights, her shoulders hunched against the November chill. The weight of her 37 years pressed down on her like the low-hanging clouds overhead, gray and unyielding. Her boots splashed through puddles reflecting fractured streetlights as she approached the Palmer residence, a stately Victorian home that sat like an island of warmth amid the gathering dusk. 6 months ago, this had been just another client house on her dog-walking route. Now it was something else entirely. Margaret paused at the gate, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. Through the front window, she could see Eleanor Palmer sitting in her armchair, a colorful scarf wrapped around her bare scalp, her once robust frame now diminished. The chemotherapy had taken its toll. Beside Eleanor sat her loyal German shepherd, Rusty, his chin resting protectively on his owner's knee, amber eyes fixed on the door as if willing Margaret to appear. Some invisible thread tugged at Margaret's heart. She'd been walking Rusty for nearly 3 years now, a steady job that helped piece together her modest living. But everything had changed 4 months ago when Eleanor's diagnosis came. Margaret pushed open the gate, its familiar creak a signal to Rusty, who immediately lifted his head. Even through the closed door, she could hear his excited whine, followed by the scrabble of his nails against the hardwood floor. Eleanor's husband, James, opened the door before Margaret could knock. The lines around his eyes had deepened since she'd last seen him 3 days ago. "Margaret," he said, relief washing over his tired face. "Thank God you're here. She's having a rough day." The warmth of the house enveloped her as she stepped inside, shrugging off her worn wool coat. Rusty circled her legs, his entire body wiggling with joy, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere permeating the home. "How bad?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice low as she crouched to greet Rusty, running her fingers through his thick fur. James's shoulders sagged. "The doctor says the cancer is responding to treatment, but the side effects—" He trailed off, glancing toward the living room where his wife sat, seemingly diminished in the large armchair. "She can barely keep water down today." Margaret nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I'll take Rusty for an extra long walk. Give you both some time." As she straightened, James reached for his wallet, but Margaret placed her hand gently on his arm. "No, James, not today." "Margaret, we can't keep letting you—" "I'm not taking payment while Eleanor's sick," she said firmly, the same words she'd been repeating for months now. "Rusty needs his walks, and you need to focus on Eleanor. That's all that matters right now." Something flickered across James's face, gratitude mingled with something deeper, something Margaret couldn't quite name. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, nodding once. "At least let me reimburse you once she's better," he said quietly. Margaret smiled, the gesture not quite reaching her eyes. "When she's better, we'll talk." She didn't say what they both feared, that better might never come. Margaret clipped Rusty's leash to his collar, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility. Before heading out, she crossed to Eleanor, whose pale face brightened slightly at the sight of her. "Hello, my dear," Eleanor said, her voice thin but warm. "You're taking my boy out in this weather? You're an angel." Margaret knelt beside the chair, taking Eleanor's frail hand in hers. The skin felt like tissue paper, the blue veins prominently visible. "Just a bit of rain. Nothing Rusty and I can't handle, right, buddy?" She glanced at the dog, whose tail thumped enthusiastically against the floor. Eleanor's eyes, still bright despite her illness, studied Margaret's face. "You know, James told me you've been refusing payment." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's nothing. Really. It's not nothing to us," Eleanor insisted, squeezing Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "You have no idea what it means, especially now." Something about the way Eleanor looked at her, as if seeing past the surface to something Margaret herself couldn't recognize, made her throat tighten. She swallowed hard. "Rusty's family," Margaret said simply. "And family takes care of each other." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "Yes," she whispered, "they do." The rain had eased to a gentle mist as Margaret guided Rusty through the quiet neighborhood streets. Unlike the frantic pace of her other dog-walking clients, these walks with Rusty had become something sacred, unhurried, contemplative. Something about Eleanor's illness had transformed this professional obligation into a deeply personal ritual. Rusty trotted beside her, occasionally glancing up as if checking on her thoughts. The steady rhythm of their footsteps on wet pavement became meditative, allowing Margaret's mind to wander. She had no family of her own in Oakwood Heights. Her parents had passed years ago, and she'd never married. Her small apartment waited empty each night, save for the ancient tabby cat who tolerated her presence. Dog walking had begun as a way to supplement her income from the bookstore where she worked part-time, but it had become something more, a connection to the living, breathing world outside her solitary existence. The Palmers' Victorian house came back into view just as the streetlights flickered on. Through the gathering darkness, Margaret could see a silhouette in the window, James, watching for their return. What Margaret couldn't know, was that inside that house a conversation was taking place that would alter the course of her life. Eleanor watched from her armchair as her husband paced the living room, legal pad in hand. "Are you absolutely certain, Ellie?" James asked, his voice cracking slightly. "We have nieces, nephews, who haven't visited once since my diagnosis," Eleanor finished, her tone gentle but firm. "Margaret has been here 3 times a week, rain or shine. She's refused payment for months. And have you seen how Rusty looks at her?" "Dogs know, James. They always know." James sank into the chair opposite his wife, studying the notes he'd been making. "The estate is substantial, Eleanor. Life insurance, investments, the house itself. We're talking millions. And who better to leave it to?" Eleanor's thin fingers plucked at the edge of her blanket. "She has no idea we've been watching her for years. How she talks to Rusty like he understands every word. How she brings those little homemade treats. How she looks at this house like it's something from a fairy tale. She'll be overwhelmed," James cautioned. Eleanor's smile was serene. "Then we'll have to prepare her, won't we? Slowly, carefully." She leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. "But first I need to get better. I need to see this through." Outside, Margaret and Rusty climbed the porch steps. The dog's nails clicked against the wood, a sound as familiar to the Palmers as their own heartbeats. James tucked the legal pad away just as the doorbell chimed. The winter deepened, and with it, Eleanor's illness. December arrived with bitter winds and early darkness, wrapping the neighborhood in a cocoon of holiday lights and quiet anticipation. For most families, it was a time of celebration. For the Palmers, each day became a precious commodity, not to be wasted. Margaret's visits increased from 3 times a week to daily. The bookstore had reduced her hours due to slow post-holiday sales, but she never mentioned this to the Palmers. Instead, she arrived each afternoon, sometimes bringing small gifts, a paperback novel Eleanor might enjoy, homemade soup, or freshly baked dog treats for Rusty. On a particularly brutal January morning, Margaret's phone rang before dawn. Her heart clenched as she saw James's number on the screen. "She's in the hospital," he said without preamble, his voice raw. "It happened so fast." "Fever, then. They think the cancer might have spread." Margaret was dressed and out the door within minutes, her own troubles forgotten in the face of the Palmers' crisis. She found James in the hospital waiting room, a crumpled coffee cup in his trembling hands. He looked up as she approached, his face haggard with fear. "Rusty's alone at the house," he said. "I'll take care of him," Margaret interrupted, squeezing his shoulder. "For as long as needed. Don't worry about anything else. Just be with Eleanor." James nodded, seemingly unable to speak. Then, surprising them both, he stood and pulled Margaret into a fierce hug. She felt the shudder that ran through his body, felt the dampness of tears against her hair. "She wants to see you," he whispered. "She made me promise." Margaret pulled back, confusion evident on her face. "Me? But surely family should—" "You are family," James said simply. "At least that's what Eleanor says." The hospital room was unnaturally quiet, the only sounds the steady beep of monitors and the whisper of the oxygen tube feeding into Eleanor's nostrils. Margaret hesitated in the doorway, struck by how small Eleanor looked amid the sterile white bedding. "Don't hover in doorways, dear," Eleanor said without opening her eyes, her voice faint but unmistakably hers. "It's impolite." Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling as she approached the bed. "How did you know it was me?" Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, the blue still vibrant despite her pallor. "Your perfume. Lavender and something else? Books, maybe? You always smell like old books." "Occupational hazard?" Margaret replied, carefully sitting on the edge of the chair beside the bed. "The bookstore practically infuses it into my skin." Eleanor's lips curved into a weak smile. She lifted one hand, and Margaret took it without hesitation, alarmed at how much weight the older woman had lost. The hospital bracelet hung loosely around her wrist. "How's my boy?" Eleanor asked. "Missing you terribly," Margaret answered truthfully. "But I'll make sure he gets extra attention until you're home." Eleanor's gaze grew distant, fixing on something beyond the hospital walls. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you." A nurse appeared in the doorway, interrupting whatever Eleanor had been about to say. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Palmer needs her rest now. The doctor will be in soon for another round of tests." Eleanor's fingers tightened around Margaret's with surprising strength. "Promise you'll come back tomorrow," she whispered urgently. "Promise me." "Of course," Margaret assured her. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." But as Margaret left the hospital, a sense of foreboding settled over her. Eleanor had wanted to tell her something important, something that couldn't wait. What if tomorrow was too late? The days blurred together as January surrendered to February. Eleanor's condition stabilized enough for her to return home, but with round-the-clock nursing care. The vibrant woman Margaret had known was fading like a photograph left too long in sunlight, her colors bleeding away day by day. Margaret now arrived each morning to take Rusty for his walk, then returned in the evening to sit with Eleanor while James took a much-needed break. During these quiet hours, Eleanor began to speak of her life, stories Margaret had never heard before. "Did you know James and I couldn't have children?" Eleanor said one evening, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Outside, snow fell in fat, lazy flakes, illuminated by the porch light. "We tried for years. Such disappointment." Margaret, knitting quietly beside the bed, looked up. "I didn't know. We considered adoption, but then life took over. James's career, my charity work." Eleanor's thin fingers plucked at the quilt covering her. "Looking back, I realize we filled our lives with everything except what we wanted most." "You have each other," Margaret offered gently. "That's more than many people find." Eleanor's gaze, sharp despite her illness, fixed on Margaret. "And you, my dear? Have you found someone to share your life with?" The question caught Margaret off guard. In all their time together, Eleanor had never pried into her personal life. "I had someone once," Margaret admitted, the words emerging before she could reconsider. "His name was David. We were engaged." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft with understanding. Margaret's hands stilled, the knitting needles falling silent. "He died. Car accident. 3 weeks before the wedding." The room seemed to hold its breath around this confession. Even Rusty, dozing at the foot of Eleanor's bed, lifted his head as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Oh, my dear girl," Eleanor whispered. "How long ago?" 8 years this April." Margaret resumed her knitting, the click of needles filling the silence. "I came to Oakwood Heights afterward. Needed a fresh start." Eleanor reached out, her cool fingers brushing Margaret's wrist. "And have you found it? Your fresh start?" Margaret considered the question, thinking of her small apartment, her aging cat, her dwindling hours at the bookstore, the dog walking that sustained not just her finances, but her spirit. The unexpected family she'd found in the Palmers and Rusty? "I think I'm still looking," she answered honestly. "But I'm closer than I was." Eleanor nodded, seeming satisfied with this response. "Sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest sorrows," she said cryptically. "Remember that, Margaret?" Before Margaret could ask what she meant, Eleanor closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted by the conversation. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Margaret continued knitting, the soft click of needles keeping time with the ticking clock on the bedside table. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. March arrived with unexpected warmth, coaxing the first crocuses from the thawing earth. Eleanor, against all medical predictions, rallied. Her appetite returned, and with it, a small measure of her former strength. She began to take short walks through the house, leaning heavily on James's arm, Rusty faithfully shadowing her every step. Margaret arrived one afternoon to find Eleanor sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets despite the mild temperature. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled with something Margaret hadn't seen in months: hope. "The doctor was here this morning," Eleanor announced as Margaret climbed the steps, Rusty's leash in hand. "He says the latest tests show improvement. The tumors are shrinking." Joy bloomed in Margaret's chest, sudden and fierce. "Eleanor, that's wonderful news." "Indeed it is," James agreed, appearing in the doorway with a tray of tea. "We're not out of the woods yet, but it's the first positive report we've had in a long time." They celebrated with tea and small sandwiches, the first outdoor meal of the season. Rusty lay contentedly at Eleanor's feet, occasionally accepting a morsel from her fingers. The afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light, transforming the ordinary moment into something precious. As Margaret prepared to leave, Eleanor beckoned her closer. "We're having a small dinner party next Saturday," she said. Nothing elaborate, just a few close friends to celebrate this good news. We'd love for you to come, not as Rusty's walker, but as our guest." Margaret hesitated. She had never socialized with the Palmers outside of her dog-walking duties. The invitation crossed an invisible boundary she hadn't realized existed until this moment. I wouldn't want to intrude on a family occasion," she stammered. Eleanor's expression softened. "Margaret Wilson, when will you understand? You are family now." James nodded in agreement. "Please come. It would mean a great deal to both of us." Faced with their sincere entreaty, Margaret found she couldn't refuse. "All right," she conceded. "I'd be honored." The week passed in a flutter of anxiety for Margaret. She fretted over what to wear, what gift to bring, what to say to the Palmers' other guests. By Saturday evening, she had changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that David had once said brought out the color of her eyes. The Palmer house glowed with warm light as Margaret approached, a bottle of wine clutched in one hand, her heart pounding an uneven rhythm against her ribs. Through the windows, she could see figures moving about, more people than she had expected. James answered the door, resplendent in a dark suit that Margaret had never seen before. "Margaret, you look lovely. Come in, come in." The entryway was filled with the mingled aromas of roasting meat and fresh flowers. Rusty bounded up, his entire body wagging with delight at seeing her in this unexpected context. Margaret knelt to greet him, grateful for the momentary distraction from her nervousness. "Most of the guests are in the living room," James said, taking her coat. "Eleanor's holding court from her favorite chair. Doctor's orders to take it easy, but you know how she is." Margaret nodded, smoothing her dress with suddenly damp palms. "Should I—" "Go right in," James encouraged. "Everyone's eager to meet you." The living room fell silent as Margaret entered, all eyes turning toward her. There were perhaps a dozen people gathered, some seated on the elegant furniture, others standing in small conversational clusters. Eleanor, as James had predicted, occupied her usual armchair, looking more vibrant than Margaret had seen her in months. She wore a silk scarf around her head, and a pendant glimmered at her throat. "Ah, here she is," Eleanor exclaimed, extending her hand. "Everyone, this is Margaret Wilson, the extraordinary woman I've been telling you all about." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks as she crossed the room to take Eleanor's hand. "I'm hardly extraordinary," she murmured. "Nonsense," Eleanor declared. "Now let me introduce you to everyone." What followed was a whirlwind of names and faces. Eleanor's doctor and his wife, the Palmers' longtime neighbors, James's colleague from the university where he taught literature, Eleanor's sister who had flown in from Arizona. Each person greeted Margaret with unusual warmth, as if they already knew her intimately. "Eleanor speaks of you constantly," the sister confided, refilling Margaret's wineglass. "To hear her tell it, you single-handedly kept this household from collapse." Margaret shook her head, embarrassed. "I just walk the dog." The sister, Catherine, Margaret recalled, studied her with knowing eyes. "My dear, you do far more than that. You've given them something invaluable, constancy in a time of chaos. Never underestimate such a gift." Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a space Margaret had glimpsed only in passing during her usual visits. Tonight it was transformed. The long mahogany table set with fine china and crystal, taper candles casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. To Margaret's surprise, she found herself seated at Eleanor's right hand, a position of honor that did nothing to ease her discomfort. She felt acutely out of place among these accomplished people with their easy conversation and shared histories. Midway through the main course, James rose, tapping his glass gently with a spoon. The room quieted as all attention turned to him. "First, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight," he began. "As you know, the past year has been challenging for our family. There were days when I feared—" His voice caught and he paused, collecting himself. "Days when I feared the worst." Eleanor reached up to squeeze his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But Eleanor is nothing if not stubborn," James continued, a smile breaking through his emotion. "And her latest scans show significant improvement. We have every reason to hope for a full recovery." A chorus of approval rippled around the table. Margaret found herself blinking back tears of relief and joy. "However," James went on, his tone shifting slightly, "this experience has taught us the importance of preparation, of making our wishes known while we still can." Margaret felt a sudden chill, despite the warm room. There was something in James's manner, a formality that hadn't been there moments before. "Eleanor and I have been blessed with a comfortable life," he said. "We've worked hard, invested wisely, and found ourselves in our later years with more than we need, and with no children of our own." He paused, his gaze sweeping the table before coming to rest on Margaret. "We've had to consider carefully what will become of our estate when we're gone." Margaret's heart began to pound. Surely he wasn't about to— "Margaret," Eleanor said softly, turning to face her, "we've asked our attorney to draw up new papers. We want you to be the primary beneficiary of our estate." The room spun. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, certain she had misheard. "I what? No, I can't possibly—" "You can and you will," Eleanor said firmly. "Unless you find the idea of caring for Rusty in his old age too burdensome?" "Of course not, but the house, our investments, the life insurance, it will all come to you," James explained. "With provisions for maintenance and care, of course. Our attorney will walk you through everything." Margaret looked around the table, expecting to see shock or resentment on the faces of Eleanor's family members. Instead, she found only gentle understanding, even approval. "But your sister," Margaret protested weakly, gesturing toward Catherine. "Surely she—" Catherine shook her head. "I have my own family, my own home, and I've seen how you are with my sister, with Rusty." "This feels right, Margaret. We know it's overwhelming," James said gently, "and nothing is imminent. Eleanor is recovering well, but we wanted you to know, to understand how much you mean to us." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks, unable to contain the tide of emotion. "I don't know what to say." Eleanor reached over, covering Margaret's trembling hand with her own. "Say you'll accept. Say you'll let us do this for you, as you've done so much for us." In that moment, surrounded by strangers who somehow felt like family, Margaret realized she had found what she'd been searching for since David's death. Not just a fresh start, but a place to belong, a purpose beyond mere survival. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Yes, I accept." Spring turned to summer, and Eleanor's recovery continued to defy medical expectations. Her strength returned gradually, like the lengthening days. By July, she was taking short walks around the neighborhood with Rusty and Margaret, her steps slow but purposeful. Margaret's life had transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The Palmers had insisted on paying her a proper salary, retroactive to the months she'd refused payment. They'd helped her find a better apartment, closer to their home. The bookstore had closed, another casualty of digital reading habits, but Margaret hardly noticed the loss of income. For the first time in years, she felt secure, valued, loved. On a golden August evening, Margaret sat with Eleanor and James on their back porch, watching Rusty chase fireflies across the lawn. The air was heavy with the scent of Eleanor's prized roses, their blooms nodding in the gentle breeze. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about the future." Margaret tensed slightly. Despite the months that had passed since the dinner party revelation, she still felt uncomfortable discussing the inheritance. It seemed morbid, especially now that Eleanor was doing so well. "Not that future," Eleanor said, noting Margaret's discomfort with her usual perceptiveness. "A different one. I'm thinking of starting a foundation." "What kind of foundation?" Margaret asked, relieved by the change in subject. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with excitement. "One that helps people like you, Margaret. Caregivers who put their own lives on hold to help others. People who refuse payment when someone is ill, even at cost to themselves." Margaret felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "I'm hardly a professional caregiver." "But you are," James interjected. "In the truest sense of the word. You care. You give. And there are others like you out there, people who step in when family can't or won't. They deserve recognition. Support. I was thinking," Eleanor continued, "that you might help us set it up, run it even." Margaret stared at her, stunned. "Me? But I don't know the first thing about running a foundation." "You know about caring," Eleanor said simply. "The rest can be learned." As the conversation unfolded, outlining a vision of grants for caregivers, training programs, respite care opportunities, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The future, once a blank, featureless expanse following David's death, now held purpose. "Direction. I could help part-time," she offered cautiously. While still walking dogs, Eleanor and James exchanged a glance, a silent communication born of decades together. "Actually," James said, "we were hoping you might consider moving in here. The East Wing has a separate entrance, its own small kitchen. It would give you privacy, but keep you close. For Rusty's sake," Eleanor added quickly. "He's getting older, and the consistency would be good for him." Margaret wasn't fooled. This wasn't about Rusty, not entirely. It was about creating a family where none had existed before, about forging connections that transcended blood ties. "I'll think about it," she promised, though in her heart, she already knew her answer. Later that night, as Margaret walked home under a canopy of stars, she found herself talking aloud to David, a habit she'd never quite abandoned. "You'd like them," she told the night sky. "Eleanor reminds me of your mother, that same quiet strength. And they've offered me something I never thought I'd have again. A family, a purpose." The summer breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling, for the first time in years, truly at peace. "I think it's time, David," she whispered. "Time to stop just surviving and start living again." Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely sound that echoed through the quiet streets. Margaret smiled, quickening her pace. Tomorrow she would tell the Palmers yes. She would move into their home, help build their foundation, and continue walking Rusty, not because she needed the money anymore, but because some connections were too precious to break. The dog walker who refused payment during her owner's cancer treatment would never know the full extent of the fortune that awaited her. But she had already received the greatest inheritance of all, a second chance at family, at purpose, at love. As autumn painted the world in shades of amber and gold, Margaret Wilson stood on the porch of what was now partly her home, watching fallen leaves dance across the lawn. Beside her, Eleanor sat bundled against the October chill, her hair, now grown back in soft silver curls, catching the late afternoon sunlight. Rusty lay at their feet, his muzzle noticeably grayer than it had been a year ago, but his eyes still bright with contentment. Inside, James was preparing dinner, the mouth-watering aroma of his famous beef stew drifting through the open window. "I spoke with the attorney today," Eleanor said, breaking the companionable silence. "Everything's finalized for the foundation. The Margaret Wilson Caregivers Fund is officially established." Margaret shook her head, still uncomfortable with having her name attached to the project. "I still think it should be the Palmer Foundation." Eleanor's laugh, stronger now than it had been in months, rang out. "Nonsense. It was your kindness that inspired it. Your refusal to accept payment when we needed help most." "I just did what anyone would do," Margaret protested. Eleanor reached over, patting Margaret's hand. "No, my dear, that's precisely the point. Not everyone would have done what you did. Most people wouldn't even consider it." They fell silent again, watching as the sun began its descent behind the distant hills, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and pink. "Do you know," Eleanor said softly, "when I was at my sickest, I used to lie awake at night, terrified not of dying, but of leaving James alone." Margaret turned to look at her, surprised by this confession. "We've been together for 43 years, Eleanor continued. "The thought of him rattling around this big house by himself with only Rusty for company, it broke my heart." "But you recovered," Margaret reminded her gently. "The doctors say you're in remission." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, and I'm grateful beyond words. But cancer, it changes you, makes you see life differently." She met Margaret's gaze. "Makes you recognize the people who truly matter." Before Margaret could respond, the front door opened and James appeared, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Dinner's ready, ladies," he announced. "And I hope you're hungry because I may have gone a bit overboard." As they gathered around the dining table, now a nightly ritual rather than a special occasion, Margaret looked at the faces of these people who had become her family. At Rusty, dozing contentedly in his bed in the corner. At the home that had welcomed her so completely. The dog walker refuses payment during owner's cancer treatment, never knowing family left her fortune. The words that had once seemed like a simple job description now held deeper meaning. The fortune wasn't just the material inheritance, the house, the investments, the foundation that bore her name. It was this, the immeasurable wealth of belonging, of mattering to someone, of finding purpose in the act of caring. As James raised his glass in their nightly toast, to family in all its forms, Margaret felt her heart swell with gratitude for Eleanor's recovery, for the twist of fate that had brought her to this house 3 years ago, for the chance to build a life rich with meaning and connection. Outside, the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight, eternal witnesses to the infinite ways human hearts find one another, even across the vast distances of circumstance and time. The fortune Margaret Wilson had found couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. It was counted instead in moments like these: shared meals, quiet conversations, the faithful devotion of an aging dog, and the love of two people who had chosen her to be part of their family when she'd needed one most. Some fortunes, after all, are beyond price.